And now that we've talked about what happens with a line calling search space and a device calling search space, the partitions are concatenated together to form the new resulting CSS with line partitions being ordered first or higher. Let's take a look at how that could possibly impact a dial plan that we might want to configure, or route patterns. Let's look at application. The device CSS, and first of all, let me go back and just remind the reasons, primarily reasons that we were using calling search spaces were path selection or site-specific call routing, that's number one, and then number two were class of restrictions. But we were using the same CSS for both functions. What we're going to seek to do now is to split those calling search spaces out into application of separate functions. So we're going to use the device CSS, as we see here, is going to allow access to all external routes, even if the person shouldn't be able to dial anywhere but internal and 911. We're going to give every calling search space, or I should say every device, every phone within any one location, any one geographic area, one city or one cluster. We're going to give them access to a single, all devices access to a single calling search space that allows access to all routes. Okay? And actually, we're going to give all devices pretty much within a country, anywhere that has, or in the U.S. case and Canada, the North America numbering plan, they share one. So any place that has similar numbering plans, we're going to give them access to all of the numbers. So regardless of whether we have one site, 100 sites, or 1,000 sites, we're going to have one calling search space that's going to give, I'm sorry, it is still going to be based on site. So got a little ahead of myself there. So per area, per geographic area, we're going to have one CSS. Okay? Then what we'll do is we will have another calling search space at the line. This will actually define class of service. So the device calling search space will define the path to the local gateway. So for each site, there will be one CSS. If I have 1,000 sites, I got a little ahead of myself. I don't have one CSS just yet. We'll get to that shortly, but one CSS just yet for all sites. I have one CSS for each site. So if I had 1,000 sites, I have 1,000 CSSs. Remember before, if I had 1,000 sites, I had to have 4,000 CSSs because I had one calling search space for each site and each class of service. Now I've got one CSS for each site that calls everywhere, and then I'm going to have 4 additional calling search spaces that will block undesired routes. Now wait a minute. What do you mean block, Mark? Don't you mean allow access to what they're allowed to dial? Well, if the device allows them to dial anything, and each of these route patterns are routed route patterns, they're not blocked, but they are routed to specific route lists and route groups, and therefore specific gateways. That's giving us our site-specific call routing. Then if we just allowed something at the line, the concatenation would be allowing, let's say, local here, and also allowing it at the device, but we're also allowing long distance and international, so we would be allowing them to call anywhere. So we can't just allow them to call somewhere at the line and consider that class of restriction. It won't block them from anything because the device allows everything. So what happens is, looking very similar to the last slide, where line device partitions and calling search spaces result in a new concatenated calling search space with new partitions what we've done is we've added the route patterns inside those partitions, and we can see that although there are more route patterns in this PSTN partition, okay, thus the ellipsis, the dot, 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 we see that we do have a route to 9.011 bang because we have all routes at the device level. But then we've got a blocked international partition and blocked international pattern. Now this happens to be a translation pattern. It doesn't really matter whether it's a translation pattern, a route pattern. You can block at the route pattern level, but you have to point to route list or route group or whatever. It will just never get there. But you don't have to, or we wouldn't even have to point to one, but the idea is that we can use a translation pattern or a route pattern, really doesn't matter, to create our blocked patterns. If it is an equal match, 9.011 bang, 9.011 bang, it's an exact equal match. Okay? If this one's even slightly less specific than this one, then what we're trying to do here won't work. But if it's an equal match and it's blocked because it's ordered higher, what we get is the result that this user cannot dial internationally, but they can dial long distance, they can dial local. There is probably 911 and internal numbers that are not pictured here, but that are a part of this PSTN partition. And so they do have the ability to dial everywhere except internationally. Now again, you might say, wait a minute, okay, maybe this makes sense. And if it doesn't, please speak up. Please mention anything, any questions at this point. But you might say this makes sense, maybe why, or maybe not why, but that we can block at the line level because of the resulting higher ordered line partition and the resulting concatenated CSS. Mouthful to say. But why would we want to do this? Well, because if I only have to create 4 blocking partitions, and technically maybe only 3, but 4 blocking partitions, 4 blocking patterns, then I only have to create 4 blocking CSSs for the entire numbering plan. So for everyone within a country, or again the US, North American numbering plan, and Canada, anyone within that numbering plan can use these 4 blocking partitions and CSSs, and then I only have to create 1 calling search space per site. Okay? So let's take a look, first of all, an example of the configuration and then the savings that will net us. So here's a translation pattern. Here we've got the actual pattern of 9.011. It's in a partition that is inside of a CSS that's applied to the line, and it's not a routing pattern, but it is a blocking pattern. Then you can choose what enunciator message you want played if it's a skinny device. Remember, H323 or skinny devices will play enunciator. Remember, MGCP, and more importantly, if it's a phone dialing, a SIP phone will not play the enunciator. Okay, so let's take a look at this. David, to answer your question, David commented, so going forward, this would be the best way to configure for all deployment types. Yes, but I would say the answer to that question is yes if you are deploying or maybe even reorganizing a 6.x cluster and before, but we haven't got to one of the new features in 7, which you'll very quickly see what it can do for us. So give me just a bit to answer definitively on whether this is the line device approach is the best method. I will go ahead and say the line device approach is the best method, but there's something more we can add on to it to give us even more savings and a lot more power and flexibility. Okay, so taking a look at building classes of service with line device approach. Remember before we had Seattle phones and Austin phones. Now we've got a separate section here above this gray line is for lines, for all lines within a country or within a dialing plan. Okay? When you have multiple countries, you do still need multiple dialing plans. You're not going to escape that. But we also have then specific Seattle devices, like Seattle phones, even Seattle gateways for inbound calls, maybe. Austin devices, and then any number of other sites we have will have devices for calling search spaces and patterns. Note that we still have to have a replication of the patterns. Okay, so here I've got the line calling search space dictates class of service or class of restriction. Here we've got two CSSs or class of restrictions pictured, internal and unrestricted. For internal, we're blocking local calls, long distance, and international. Unrestricted is simply something that points to the internal DN. Now, you could note that as long as the device has a calling search space that points to internal, you actually don't even have to have this CSS defined and applied to a line. The reason that we do that is for our own ID10T error, our own administrative, or actually possibly if we're designing, implementing, and then turning it over to a customer, just any possible mistakes where someone sees, oh, wait a minute, I know that these many fields or checkboxes or drop-downs are supposed to be filled in within any given page. And I'm on a line page for a phone, and I know that it's calling search space because people that deployed it for us, they're gone, but they told us that every line and device should have a CSS, and the CSSs for the device are named, site-specific devices like Seattle devices, Austin devices. And then the ones for the lines are the class of restriction. They might just see 3 class of restriction CSSs when they do a drop-down, and they see a number of devices that don't have a CSS configured. Although they would still work properly, there would just be a little bit of confusion and possibly misconfiguration due to that. So that's the reason we go ahead and create the unrestricted class of restriction. Okay, so now we look at the device CSS dictates path selection. This CSS points only, other than internal, points only to the route patterns that point only to the Seattle route list and point only to the Seattle route groups and gateways. And our Austin devices point only to the Austin route patterns, the Austin route lists, and the Austin route groups and gateways. So now, instead of n times 4, which is what we had last time, number of sites times number of class of restrictions, we now have n plus 4. So instead of 1,000 times 4 equaling 4,000, we've now got n plus 4, or 1,004. 1,000 CSSs, one for each site, 1,000 sites, but only 4 class of restrictions if we're still all in the same country or dialing plan. That's a savings of almost 3,000 CSSs and almost 3,000 partitions. That's a tremendous savings. We're now at 5,992 savings of entities, CSSs and partitions combined that we have to create in CUCM. That's a lot less work. Okay? Slide is still, we have some considerations to think of, but before we go on to considerations, and then before we build on this to add one more level of complexity, but then also tremendous savings, and when you see it, ultimately that complexity turns into a tremendous ease of use, ease of troubleshooting, ease of building, scalability, moving forward, design, administration. Before we move on to that, does anyone have any questions regarding the basic line device approach? The line blocks whatever we don't want them to call. The device allows everything to a specific route pattern. We still have, if we have 1,000 sites and we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 route patterns, we've still got 6 patterns times 1,000 sites, 6,000 patterns, 6,000 route list, or sorry, 1,000, one for every site, 1,000 route lists, 1,000 route groups. Still got a lot of stuff we have to configure, but we've saved ourselves a tremendous, and even if you take this down to 100, the savings are still exponential. There's still tremendous savings here.
Hey, so quick question on this. You just got the internal CSS that obviously has all the block partitions. So you would have, say if I had local CSS, I would just have block partitions for everything except local, calling, long distance, and international. Is that correct?
Yes, so if I had so right, the CSS for internal blocks everything except for internal. And the reason internal is allowed has nothing to do with the CSS on the line, but because the device plus the line device points to the internal partitions. Right. So for the local, if we wanted to have a local class of restriction, local CSS would point to a partition. That partition would have the patterns in it. So in this case, we'd split up. There wouldn't just be a partition called blocked PSTN. We'd have a partition for local and a pattern, a translation pattern with a blocked. Actually, sorry. First of all, we'd have blocked international as a partition, blocked long distance as a partition, blocked local as a partition, and blocked. Really, that would be it, because ultimately you can't block emergency calls or internal, or else you don't really have a phone system. You have a paperweight. So the blocked long distance would have a pattern for long distance that was blocked. Blocked international would have a pattern for international that was blocked. Blocked local would have a pattern for local that was blocked. So if I wanted a local class of restriction, I'd create a local CSS for the line, and in it I would add the partitions, which would inherently add the patterns. I would add the partitions for blocked international and blocked long distance, and that's it.
Okay, cool.
Local, internal, would automatically be allowed because of the device allowing everything.
I just wanted to point out too, I mean, I do this on a regular basis at customer sites, and every time you go to do it, it's still something you got to kind of take a half a step back, think through the logic on, and kind of map it out on paper before you start to program it, because it almost is counterintuitive when you're blocking calls with a calling search space. So if it doesn't make sense at first, it really is something you have to take a half a step back and rethink the way you, if all you do is a device calling search space all the time, you've got to rethink the way you do things a little bit, because you're not just allowing calls, now you're allowing and blocking.
Exactly correct. Thanks for that, Michael. That's it's very true. It is very counterintuitive, or against your, kind of what you're thinking. You're thinking of allowing the user to only call certain numbers, 911, internal numbers, and local numbers, let's say. You're not actually typically in the mindset of approaching it from the reverse direction and blocking them from calling international and long distance or national numbers. So another way to think about this, right before we get started here with the whiteboard, is almost that when you're looking at this kind of a way of deploying systems, moving forward, or even studying in your own lab time or the actual CCIE Voice Lab, do it as if you're going to go ahead and make the assumption that every phone can call everywhere by default, and it's your job to stop them from calling the places they shouldn't call. And in thinking of that, you'll go ahead and you'll create your allowed route patterns in a single partition for each site. Not soon. Soon we'll actually come up with a way here for that, but for the time being, with what slides and concepts we've looked at so far, you'll by default create one partition and a set of patterns for each site that allow everything, and then you'll just go about kind of thinking things reverse direction. Okay, now that everyone has on their device the ability to call everywhere, and maybe even just test that, not every single phone, 400 phones at 1,000 sites, but maybe even just one phone at each site, as you're setting it up in a lab or even maybe going to deploy it live, make sure that they can dial all the patterns and all the phones have the exact same CSS on the device, because you would do it through the BAT tool, of course, the bulk administration tool. And then go about blocking individual lines and thinking about, okay, everyone can call everywhere, then what is it we have to restrict them in order to build this class of restriction? That's one of the reasons I like to refer to it instead of class of service. Instead of what service do you have, look at it as a class of restriction. So what restrictions do you have? Where is it that you are restricted from dialing? And that helps me, at least, even in my own designs, to keep it straight in terms of, oh, that's right, we're restricting, so we have to block at the line. We have to actually restrict them from calling where they are otherwise able to call. So let's take a look here. We've got, this phone, and it's going to be at Seattle, and it should be allowed to have long distance rights only, LD, or national. Then we've got another phone at Seattle. I'm only going to draw one site, just for the sake of space, that can call local, and another Seattle phone there. Another Seattle phone that can dial restricted, or internal, and 911 call. Okay, so I've got here a calling search space for international. Won't use. This phone has a calling search space CSS for long distance. Local. Phone has the calling search space for Okay, so now I've got partitions. I'll make those orange. Partition. Got a concept, local emergency, internal. So the restricted calling, well, actually, let's draw our patterns first. So now we've got our, and we would probably do better to name these block international, block long distance, block local. We never really want to block emergency or internal. Those would be part of our allow partitions, but not part of our block. So our block partitions are going to be separate from our. Okay. So now we'll have our patterns. So we're going to have a 9.0, and then we're just going according to the North American numbering plan right now. Again, you would have to have one of these for each country or numbering plan. 9.011, 9.011 hash, 1. I'm just going to write 10 X's. North American numbering plan That would and then we're going to have a 9.10x's. That's going to be a local number. Depending on where in the US you are, you can dial 10 or 7 digits. Differentiating factor is that first digit's a 1. This cannot be a 1. That just to differentiate at least that. And then I've got 911 and internal patterns, but again, those wouldn't be blocked, so I don't want to draw those necessarily in red. Okay, so my international block is going to point. Actually draw it this way because the patterns are, well, we'll draw it from the perspective of the call. So draw the partitions pointing to the patterns. Patterns are inside the partitions, but from the perspective of calling, we call through the CSS to the partition and eventually find patterns within that. We've got our block long distance, and we've block local. Doesn't block anything, internal doesn't block anything. So if I want my phones to have a restricted calling search space, as we see here, then I'm going to need to make sure that their restricted CSS block local, the block long distance, block international. If they only should have local rights, then we only need to block long distance and international. If they should have long distance, then we only need to block international. If they have international, we don't need to block anything. Everything's pretty much open. So that's where you saw we could either not assign any calling search space, or we would actually point them to the allow internal partition and allow emergency partition. Okay, but blocking partitions in any way. And again, the only reason we would do that, the only reason we'd set up an international CSS or unrestricted was simply so that we could have something to apply to the actual line, so that going back later, ourselves or other administrators wouldn't possibly become confused as to why that drop down for CSS on a given phone's line had been left blank. We've only got actually a few more slides, I think about 6 more slides. So everyone understands the tremendous savings there. As long as everyone's clear on line device approach, 1, how to do it, 2, why we might want it, other than just Cisco best practice, recommended practice. And let's move on to, well, first of all, let's take a look at some of the considerations with line device, and then we'll take a look at the next building block. So line device approach considerations, some are the call forward all, calling search space, activation policy. So this actually came about in 6.x CUCM. In CUCM version 4 and version 5, we were still able to use the line device approach, and even back in certain versions of 3, although at some point there was actually a switch in the order of the partition ordering, although there has always been the resulting concatenated search space. But back in 4 and 5, versions 4 and 5, if we wanted a call forward all, now this isn't getting into call forward busy, no answer, each of those still only have one CSS. One CSS for call forward busy internal, one CSS for call forward busy external, one CSS for call forward no answer, internal, external, no coverage, failure, on unregistered, there's a number of different ones. But for call forward all, we also always only had one CSS. Now, in previous versions, actually, you have to take a look at the release notes for each one. In 4.x, it says that you should always configure it because varying results may occur. In other words, from release to release, maintenance release to maintenance release, within 4.x, you might actually have differing results, or your mileage may vary, as some say. But largely, the way it was in 4 and 5 was that whatever line CSS and device CSS you had, that resulting concatenated CSS would be the default CSS applied to the forward all. That was in CUCM version 4 and 5. In version 6, we now actually have, and if you wanted to change that, in other words, if you wanted to restrict someone from pressing the call forward all soft key and not being able to forward all their calls internationally, even though they're allowed to call during the day internationally, maybe they're a purchasing agent, they purchase a lot of things from overseas, we don't want them forwarding their calls because we could get into toll fraud options, right? If someone, got a little intelligence and realized that all they have to do is forward their call to, a girl or a guy that they met while they were on one of their purchasing business trips in another country, they just forwarded their phone to that person's cell phone, let's say, and then they went home and they called their own DID or called into the auto attendant and rang to their extension, and it forwarded all calls on to that person's international cell phone or mobile. Well, that's toll fraud. You're using the company's dime to sit and talk to your boyfriend or girlfriend for hours after work hours or whatever. So there's a lot of potential there for toll fraud. It was always, and still is always, a good idea to specifically set the calling search space for a call forward all, regardless of whether there's actually anything filled in the destination. Okay? Because then when someone goes to press the soft key for call forward all on their phone, the one call forward option that almost everyone primarily has control over, well, you could take that away as well. Then as they fill in digits, if that doesn't match, in other words, if a pattern or DN doesn't match based on not being found in a directory in your filing cabinet or not being found in a partition within your calling search space already pre-configured on your call forward all line page for CSS, then you won't be able to, you'll actually get reorder tone as you're putting in your call forward all destination on your actual physical phone. So that's a good idea to limit call forward all to begin with. The problem was line device approach. If I just limit line, by using the line CSS, then that only restricts, it doesn't allow, but the device CSS allows everything. So neither are good approaches. So in 6.x, that's where we actually have a primary and a secondary calling search space for call forward all. That way we can fill in our line and our device, line calling search space up top, device calling search space here. This allows all calls to go through and goes to the proper gateway. This restricts which of those allowed calls should not be. So maybe restrict international but allow long distance and everything else. On top of that, we actually have the calling search space activation policy. By the way, these are two of the same screenshot, okay, that you see here and then you see here. I only captured it twice. That way you could see the drop down from the calling search space activation policy. Otherwise it covers those two forward all primary and secondary CSS. So the calling search space activation policy is by default use system default. Or I can say with configured CSS, which is whatever I put here and here or just here. Okay, I can either have just the primary CSS if I want, or I can put both. That's the policy with configured CSS. With activating device line CSS, that says forget about putting anything here, just go ahead and use whatever class of restriction and local gateways that I normally use on my line device. Go ahead and use that for my call forward all as well. Okay, so here we're showing the configured call forward all and secondary are used. Pretty much what I just said without necessarily having to read what I wrote. The activating line device, the call forward primary and secondary automatically get populated from the directory number, and use system default with configured is obviously whatever we configure. Use system default is the cluster-wide service parameter, which determines what that will be. Okay, some more considerations. Blocking translation patterns configured within the line must be at least as specific as the route patterns within the device. We already said that, but it's good to reiterate it. If they happen to be less specific, then most specific matching of patterns will take effect, even if the partitions are ordered lower. Particularly, watch for the @ wildcard. That might sound like a very broad wildcard, but believe it or not, its patterns are very, very specific because it only works with route filters. Okay, so watch for that @ wildcard. It can actually be very specific. AAR uses a different calling search space for rerouted calls. In most cases, the CSS can be the same as the unrestricted site-specific device CSS, but in some cases this might not be desirable.
Does the activation policy only affect call forward all, or does it affect all of the other options as well?
All of the other options, meaning all of the other call forward options? Okay, yes, that it is just for the call forward all. It does not take into consideration call forward busy, call forward no answer. And the reason is, while those options can be given to users to configure on their CCM user page, most typically, if we're giving them to the users, then we already have a good degree of trust in them, but maybe not. There's probably certainly arguments to be made why we might not. But normally those are configured by administrators, and so a single CSS for that typically is sufficient. And then this is something very important to keep in mind, which is that the priority order, the ordering of the partitions within the resulting concatenated CSS between line and device, is actually reversed for CTI route points and ports. Okay? This is actually the way they all were. So device partitions are ordered higher than the line partitions. This is the way all devices were before Call Manager 3.1, so 3.0. After 3.1, line became first and then device. But for CTI, this is still backwards. It's never been changed. And because it was never changed, they are probably pretty hesitant to do it now, because as you upgrade, it could break a lot of existing large configurations. So if they reverse the order on you, you reverse it on them, right? So in other words, for CTI route points and ports, configure a line calling search space on the CTI device page, and configure the device CSS on the CTI line page. So if they reverse it on you, you reverse it on them, and then you can still use the line device approach even on CTI ports and route points. Okay, so now let's take a look at a new function within 7.0. This is not in 6.x. Within 7.0, we have this new idea of a local route group. A local route group, or also referred to as standard local route group, whether you hear local route group or standard local route group, LRG or SLRG, they are the same things. This is a dynamic entity that is always, even before you've created, remember we talked about the configuration order. We configure our gateways, then we configure route groups and place the gateways and trunks in them, then we configure route lists and put our route groups within them, and then we create our route patterns and put our route lists inside of them, or point our route patterns to the route list. But we have to configure the opposite direction. Before we've even configured any route groups, we can now configure a route list and point it to something that always exists in CUCM 7 always exists in the route list, and that is the standard local route group. Okay, standard local route group. This is a dynamic entity. What this does is anytime somebody triggers the local or standard local route group, it goes back to the calling party and says, hey, what was your device pool? And your device pool contains some valuable information for me called your local route group. Your local route group points to a specific, not this dynamic entity, but a specific entity that I'll use to replace myself, and that's going to contain whatever route group you actually have configured there. So we still have to configure our route groups. Okay? So let's take a look. We've still got the line device approach. We've still got our restricted and unrestricted CSS. Restricted still points to blocked partitions and blocked patterns. Unrestricted still points to internal only, allowing. And if we had a couple other CSSs we just looked at. But now, take a look at this. As this call, and this is actually for a Seattle phone, I forgot to note that this was a Seattle phone. As that call goes through the one calling search space, goes through the one pattern. Okay, I'm only going to have one set of patterns. Remember before we said if we had 1,000 sites, we still needed 1,000 patterns times the number of, well, types of patterns times the number of sites. So if I had 1,000 sites and I had 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 patterns, I would still need 6 patterns per site, or 6,000 patterns. Why? Because the pattern points to the route list. And I still need, or needed, 6,000 route lists to point to each individual route group. Well, what if I have this dynamic entity here which says, based on who's calling, that's how I'll determine which route group to pick. Now I can have, instead of 1,000 route lists, one for each site, I think I just said 6,000, but instead of having 1,000 route lists, one for each site, I can now have one route list. One. At least for a given country or numbering plan. Now I realize that it won't completely simplify things as I'm about to do. In other words, there will still be exceptions. You'll still have customers, you'll still have needs. On the CCI voice exam, you'll still have reasons why you very well may need to create multiple route lists. That being said, if I had 1,000 sites and I still need to create a few different backup ones, it's going to be a lot less to create maybe 50 or even 100 route lists for all the various exceptions than it is to create 1,000. Or even if I have 100 sites, maybe not 1,000 sites, but 100 sites. Instead of creating 100 route lists, maybe I need 10 or 15. That's still, you know, an 80, 85, 90% savings, depending on how many you still need. Entities that I need to create. Where I had 1,000 sites and I had 6 patterns and I needed to create 6 patterns times 1,000 sites, 6,000 patterns, I now need to create 6 patterns for the entire North America. So I have a tremendous savings. Okay, so what happens? That call, let's just watch the call go through again. Call goes through, 911 hits the one route list, hits the one dynamic entity called local route group. That goes back to the calling party's device pool, finds the local route group, takes that, and replaces itself with that actual explicitly configured route group, the Seattle route group, and it routes the call on to the Seattle gateways. Likewise, when an Austin phone dials through to 911, same pattern, same partition, same route list, same dynamic entity of local route group. Local route group goes back to the calling party, says, what's your device pool? Inside of there, what's your explicit route group? I found that it's the Austin route group. I'll replace myself with that route group, and the call is routed out to the Austin gateways via the Austin route group. Okay, so let's remember, we started with N times C, or sites times classes. So 1,000 sites times 4 classes was 4,000 CSS. And we started out with 6,000 patterns 1,000 partitions, and 1,000 route lists and 1,000 route groups. Okay? So now, actually with the line device approach, we changed 1,000 times 4 to 1,000 plus 4, and we took 4,000 CSSs down to 1,004 CSSs. We still had 6,000 patterns, 1,000 partitions, 1,000 site-specific CSSs. That was the 1,000 of the 1,004, 4 for the restricted blocked, 1,000 route lists and 1,000 route groups. With line device approach, it's no longer sites times classes, it's country or dialing plan plus classes. Okay, so we have one here, we only have one country or one dialing plan plus 2 class of restrictions, or actually I had forgot I was using 4 as the example. This 2 still reflects here, so 1 plus 2 does not equal 5. That's a typo. But with 4 classes and 1 country, I now have 5 calling search spaces total. I'd have 4 block partitions, actually 3 block partitions plus my internal plus my PSTN partition, so I have 5 partitions. Instead of 6,000 patterns, I have 6 patterns. Instead of 1,000 route lists, I have 1 route list. The one thing I still do have to have is at least one route group for each site. So if I have 1,000 sites, I still have 1,000 route groups. And those route groups I place inside the device pool. I no longer give them directly to a route list, but I place them inside of the device pool, because this standard local route group dynamic entity will go back to the calling party's device pool, whoever picked up the phone and placed the call, and look to its local route group to try to find a replacement for itself to know where to route the call. So we're just talking about 4,000 CSSs, roughly 4,000 CSSs that we've saved, but we didn't add in yet 6,000 patterns, 4,000 partitions, 3,099, so that's 10,000, plus 1,000 route lists. Sorry, 1,000 partitions, 1 for each site. So that's 6, 7, 8,000 entities plus the 4,000. We've now saved almost 12,000 entities on a 1,000 site cluster. Tremendous amount of savings in terms of configuration, troubleshooting, scalability. If I want to add more sites, all I do is create a route group and add it to the device pool. That's it. Everyone's still, as long as it's within the same country, everyone still points to the same partition. Now, there are going to be some exceptions. What if I want to have backup gateways? Okay, so let's take a look at that. And this is actually our last slide. And then we'll get into the configuration. So here, I've got still my Seattle phone and my Austin phone. And they're still going to point to the one calling search space. But certain patterns are going to be pointing towards, let's say, 911, 9911, and local. We still want those to point to our local route list, which only points to standard local route group. Okay, so maybe the first call goes through. Oh, you know what? I didn't have one for the first call. So the first call goes through from Seattle and dials 911 for an emergency, routes out the local only route list, which only routes to the local route group, goes back, looks at his device pool, finds out the local route group, replaces it with itself, and sends it to the Seattle gateway. That still happens normally. But now the Austin phone wants to send a call to either long distance or international. I think it's long distance here. I guess it's the Seattle phone, sorry. Seattle phone wants to send it to international. So we have those patterns pointing to a different route list. And that route list has a first preference of explicitly configured headquarter gateways. So there's going to need to be some form of digit manipulation to make sure they route properly. But they're going to always, if those set of gateways is available for long distance international calls, they're always going to route to those headquarter gateways first. Because our headquarter, maybe our headquarter is Seattle, who knows? But our headquarter has, we've got 12 PRIs and we've got some great rates negotiated with the carrier. So we want all calls to route across the WAN out here first. But then, maybe the WAN's down. So if the WAN's down, then we're going to choose our second option, which will route to standard local route group. And then we still have site-specific local failover for each of the 1,000 sites. For all the 1,000 sites, long distance international, always route across the WAN up to headquarters. But in the case that the WAN's down, well, I guess if the WAN's down, then maybe the call volume is full or one of the gateways is down. If the WAN's down, we're in SRST mode probably, unless we have a distributed cluster, which is possible as well. Maybe that route isn't available for whatever reason. Trunks are full, and so we will fail over to our site-specific local route group based on this dynamic standard local route group entity. So you asked David earlier, was that the best deployment going forward? And you were referring to the line device approach. And I would say that now, if you're working on a 7.0 cluster or later, that the best deployment is line device approach with local route group and some variations thereof. Okay? So you're going to probably need to have some different backup. We'll definitely talk about THO a little later, David. You asked about THO. You said, so for THO, would we just create route list for those area codes and gateways? We're actually not going to talk about THO today, or AAR, or call forward on register, or single number reach, or device mobility, or extension mobility, or SRST, all things that are very potentially impacting or are very potentially impacted with local route group. And the reason we're not going to talk about them today is because we're going to get into our configuration here next and make sure that everything's solid on the fundamentals, because once we introduce globalization and localization tomorrow, if I went ahead and talked about all of those things that I just mentioned, AAR, THO, all of that, if I went ahead and talked about them today, we would just basically have to forget everything that we looked at, because there would be a lot of digit manipulation depending on, am I crossing area code boundaries within a country, so city boundaries? Am I crossing country boundaries? There's a lot of different digit manipulation things we'll have to look at. What we'll see tomorrow is that globalization and localization is going to so drastically simplify all of that that it's really not worth going into today. But you would, if you were looking at just this with local route group, which is a feature of 7, so if you're using this, you should also go ahead and use the other features of 7, being globalization, localization. But if you were just using this, you would create specific route lists that had particularly, the areas and the gateways that you wanted to do the hop-off, the tail-end hop-off, and you'd have to format the digit manipulation. This is also one of the reasons why, before, I think this is the last slide, before we get into our tasks for the day, this is also the reason that calling party and call-ed party transformation CSS out at the gateway level, okay, so still in CUCM web page, but the gateway or trunk for the, within CUCM, why we now have in 7.0 calling and call to party transformation CSS there. Because think about it. Earlier, when we were saying that we could do digit manipulation at the route pattern level, right? And we could also do it at the route list details. That was the route group within the route list. That was the second place we could do it. If we could just do it at those two places, think about what would happen. I might want certain, let's say, calling party numbers Well, actually, let's even just look at cont'd party numbers. What if I wanted, here we only show long distance and international, routing out this route list that sends it up to a specific headquarter route group before going to local. Those might not have to be changed too much in their digit manipulation. Just drop pre-dot and you're fine. But what about local dialing and 7-digit local dialing? If I send this 7-digit local dialing out a route list that first goes up to a route group for headquarter gateways, I might have to do some form of digit manipulation to prefix whatever whatever area code they were trying to dial out of, and also add on based on the route pattern, one for national access code, the area code they were trying to dial, things of that nature. Now we could fix this with 10-digit dialing for local calls. I realize that, but there still might need to be some variations of cont'd party. Also calling party. Maybe I want my calling party number to look one way. If I do it at the route pattern and don't do it anywhere else, then it's going to take effect for not only Seattle phones, but all other sites' phones. What about if I do it at the route list details, route group within the route list? By the way, you can do digit manipulation for standard local route group as part of the route list, so the route list details for standard local route group. But again, this is going to take effect for every site's calling party that traverses through this single set of patterns and route list details. We probably don't want to uniformly impact everyone in the same fashion. We probably want to impact them based on where they come from. So now, depending on where they're leaving, the egress point out to the PSTN, the gateway, we can say, based on whoever you were, calling party, we'll match your calling party number. And once we match specific numbers, then we'll only transform those calling party numbers when they leave our gateway. So not even just everyone that leaves our gateway, but only maybe say, maybe this is a 2000 series set of DNs at Austin and a 1000 series set of DNs at Seattle. So we would match, let's say we wanted to transform Austin but not Seattle. If we did it at the route pattern, transforms everyone. We do it at the route list details, transforms everyone. Why? Because we don't have patterns for each site anymore. We don't have route lists for each site anymore. So instead at the gateways, I can say, set up a new CSS that only has one partition in it, and we'll name it intuitively, and that partition should only be applied to a single pattern that is a calling party transformation pattern, and that matches the 2000 series set of numbers, the Austin numbers. So the pattern will be 2XXX in a partition for Seattle gateways calling, or ANI, only visible by the Seattle gateways ANI CSS, and then we will only ever match people that leave Seattle but come from Austin, and will manipulate their calling party number in a very specific way. This is one of the complexities of having to think about matching the actual pattern for cont'd or calling again, but we also get a very fine, granular, detailed level of control because we're so, we're muddying the waters. We're making the patterns ubiquitous. We're making them ambiguous. We're making the route lists ambiguous. It doesn't really matter who accesses them anymore, as long as they're from the same, numbering plan, the same dialing habits, same country, typically. There was the route back from the second choice. The local route group goes back to the device pool and found the Seattle gateways. we have one more quiz I put together. So, with the advent of standard local route groups, is the line device approach to calling search space assignment still necessary? Let's go back and look at this. What was our reason for having the line device approach restricted up here? What was the reason for splitting out line line CSSs, which denoted class of service or class of restriction, versus device calling search spaces, which denoted the path selection or site-specific call routing? The reason was we had 1,000 sites, so we had 1,000 CSSs, and we had 4 class of restrictions, right? But now we effectively only have 1 site, because local route group allows 1 CSS to point to 1 partition with all the patterns, go out 1 route list, and then it decides where the call should go based on who was the calling party. So we don't need to have 1,000 CSSs here anymore. So could we not just have 4 CSSs, kind of go back to the traditional approach, and those 4 CSSs were class of restriction specific, or class of service specific if we want to be inclusive versus exclusive. We had 1 for CSS allow long distance, 1 for CSS allow international, 1 for CSS allow local, 1 for CSS allow restricted, internal and emergency, and then not do anything on the line. Well, for this simple illustration that we have here, and believe it or not, this is very simple compared to some of the things we can talk about and get into, technically, we don't need it. See, it's still considered best practice, and some things don't use local route group. There are definitely some things that we're probably not going to want to set up with local route group. What if we don't, what if we set certain phones that never use local route group? Probably everyone should route to their own call at some point, but there very well may be, and as people are actually moving and upgrading their clusters to 7.0, some people that I know are going from 6, whether upgrading through 7 or not, they're ultimately going on to 8. But there are certainly a lot of people that have not yet, if not most people, that have not yet found or deployed the power of local route groups. And remember, for those that do have a large number of clusters, whether you have 1 cluster with a large number of sites or a large number of sites distributed across multiple clusters, you probably have already moved to the line device approach long, long ago, and you've already got everything set up. Local route groups sounds great, but you're not yet ready to go and redesign everything just to have savings that wouldn't be savings because you've already configured everything. Moving forward, you might design with that in mind, but all of your existing would actually take a lot of work to move away from. So you should definitely still use the line device approach, but as you begin doing new greenfield deployments, new designs, certainly thinking about it in terms of the CCIE Voice lab practical exam, or even upgrading and adding on to your cluster, then begin factoring in the local route groups, but you should definitely still use the line device approach. If you're only using local route groups and you have a very simple deployment, as we showed on the last, or a very simple plan, as we showed on the last slide, it could potentially not be necessary. It is still best practice.